Old lady's toy, he said. You collecting antiques, Teach? The whistle hit the gym floor and skittered across the wood. 20 students watched. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Tyler Vance was 18 years old, captain of the wrestling team, son of the most powerful man on the college board. He'd humiliated teachers before. None of them ever pushed back. Claire Bennett didn't raise her voice. She walked over, she bent down, she picked up her father's whistle, slipped it into her pocket, and said 4 words. Take your seat. That was all. What Tyler didn't know was that the whistle belonged to a man who trained 3 generations of fighters in this town. What he didn't know was that his own father once swept that man's gym floor for free lessons. And what nobody in that room knew was who Claire Bennett used to be before she ever walked in with a clipboard.
There is a kind of silence that scares people more than shouting ever could. Most folks never learn that. Claire Bennett knew it before she turned 9 years old. This is her story. It starts on a Monday morning in a town called Millbrook, Ohio. Nothing special about the town. A diner on Main Street, a hardware store that never changed its sign in 40 years, a community college on the edge of town, brick buildings, a parking lot that always sat half empty except during finals week. Claire Bennett walked into that college on a September morning carrying a canvas bag and a whistle around her neck. She was 23 years old, new to teaching, new to Millbrook, though not really new at all. She grew up 3 streets over from that campus in a small house with a crooked porch step her father never got around to fixing. Folks just didn't know her yet. Not as a teacher, anyway. She had been hired to run the morning wellness and fitness course, a basic requirement class, the kind most students take because they have to, not because they want to. Her classroom was the gymnasium. Old wood floors scuffed pale in the middle from decades of sneakers. A faded mural of a wildcat on the far wall, its paint chipping near the tail, bleachers that creaked when anyone sat down too fast, and a scoreboard nobody had bothered to update since some championship game in the 90s. She stood at the door that morning, clipboard in hand, and watched her students file in. The gym smelled like it always did in the morning. Floor wax, old rubber, a little bit of dust drifting down from the vents overhead, catching the early light in thin gold lines. Claire liked that smell. It reminded her of a different gym, a smaller one, across town, one that hadn't held a real class in almost 3 years. She pushed that thought aside and kept watching the door. Grown men and women, mostly. A community college draws all kinds. A mother of 2 coming back to finish a degree she'd started before her kids were born. A factory worker retraining for something new after a plant closure. A few kids, straight out of high school, 18 years old, still walking like the world owed them something and hadn't paid up yet. One of those kids was Tyler Vance, 18 years old, broad shoulders, the kind of walk that says, I already know how this ends. He was a freshman, technically, though he carried himself like he'd already run the place for years. He was the captain of the wrestling team, an unusual thing for a first-year student, but not unheard of when a kid arrives already strong, already confident, already accustomed to people clearing a path for him. Everyone on campus knew his name before they knew his face, and everyone knew his father's name even better. Richard Vance sat on the board of trustees for Millbrook Community College. Richard Vance had his name on a plaque in the front hallway, right next to the trophy case engraved in brass that somebody polished twice a year without fail. Tyler walked into that gymnasium like he owned it, because, in a way, he believed he did. Claire called roll that morning, same as any teacher would. She read down the list, name after name. When she got to his, she said it clean and clear. Tyler Vance. He didn't answer. He just looked at his friends, the 2 boys sitting next to him, and grinned. Claire said it again. Tyler Vance. Still nothing. A few students shifted in their seats. Nobody likes watching somebody get made fun of, but nobody likes being the one to speak up either. That's just how rooms work sometimes, especially rooms full of strangers still figuring out where they fit. Finally, Tyler raised his hand, slow, lazy, like he was doing her a favor. Here, he said, teach. He said the word teach the way some people say a slur, low, mocking, with a smirk tucked right behind it. A few of his friends laughed. One of them, a heavy-set young man everyone on campus called Sully, laughed the loudest, though. Something in his eyes looked a little unsure, even as the sound left his mouth. Claire didn't flinch. She marked the roll sheet and moved to the next name. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 10 minutes into class, while Claire explained the syllabus, Tyler leaned over to his friend and said loud enough for half the gym to hear that they finally hired a teacher young enough to still need a babysitter herself. More laughter. Not everyone, but enough. Claire kept talking, kept her voice even. She had a rule she lived by, one her father taught her a long time ago. Never let them see the fight land. She finished going over the syllabus. She explained the fitness requirements, the attendance policy, the safety rules for the equipment room, all of it, delivered in the same steady, unhurried voice, like nothing in the room had bothered her at all. And that was when Tyler stood up. He walked toward her, slow, easy, like he had all the time in the world. He stopped a foot away from her, close enough to make a point, not close enough to get in real trouble. "You're gonna need this," he said, and he reached out and grabbed the whistle hanging around her neck. He yanked it, hard. The cord snapped. The whistle fell to the gym floor and skittered across the wood landing near the free throw line. The whole room went quiet. That whistle was old. Brass, dull with age, a small dent on one side, the kind of dent that comes from being dropped once, a long time ago, by somebody who cared enough to pick it back up. It had belonged to her father. Nobody in that room knew that. Tyler looked down at it, then back up at her, smiling. "Old lady's toy," he said. "You collecting antiques, Teach?" A few students laughed again, though this time it sounded thinner, less sure of itself. Claire looked at the whistle on the floor. She looked at Tyler. Her heart was pounding. Nobody could tell. That was a skill, too, years in the making. "Keep your face still," her father used to say. "Let them wonder what's underneath it. Wondering does more damage than knowing ever could." She did not raise her voice. She walked over slow and steady and bent down and picked it up. She turned it over in her palm once. Then she looped the broken cord around her hand and slipped it into her pocket. She looked up at Tyler. "Take your seat," she said. Just that, 4 words. No anger in them, no fear either. Tyler blinked like he expected more, like he wanted more. When she gave him nothing else, he shrugged and walked back to his seat and told his friends it was a joke. She couldn't take a joke. Class continued. Claire finished the lesson exactly on time. She did not report it to anyone that day. She did not raise her voice for the rest of the hour. But something in that gymnasium had shifted, and everyone in the room felt it, even if nobody could say exactly what it was. At lunch, Claire sat alone in the faculty lounge, a small room with a coffee machine older than most of the students on campus, and a bulletin board still pinned with flyers from an event 2 semesters past. Margaret Doyle came in a few minutes later. Margaret taught mathematics. She had been at Millbrook for 26 years. Gray hair pulled back, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. The kind of woman who noticed everything and said little, mostly because she'd learned a long time ago that saying little usually got you further than saying everything. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from Claire. "I heard about first period," she said. Claire looked up. "Word travels fast around here. It's a small campus." Margaret took a sip of her coffee. "You should report that boy." "For what?" Claire said. "Being rude? For putting his hands on you." Claire looked down at the whistle sitting on the table beside her tray. She had tied a new piece of string through the loop that morning, a temporary fix, the knot still a little clumsy. "He didn't put his hands on me," she said. "He put his hands on my whistle." "Claire, I'm serious, Margaret. If I go running to the dean over a kid grabbing a whistle off my neck, what happens the next time? He does something worse. I'll have used up my 1 card on nothing." Margaret studied her for a long moment. "You're awfully calm for someone who just got humiliated in front of a room full of strangers." Claire wrapped her hand around her coffee cup. Margaret noticed the knuckles, the way the skin sat thick and calloused across 2 of them. The kind of callus that doesn't come from grading papers. She didn't ask about it, not yet. "I don't go looking for trouble," Claire said quietly, "but I don't run from it either. Not when it finds me." Margaret raised an eyebrow, but she let it go. She glanced toward the small window overlooking the parking lot where a line of faculty cars sat baking under the September sun. "This town's got a long memory," she said, half to herself. "Longer than most people give it credit for." "Meaning what?" "Meaning nothing gets forgotten around here. It just gets buried for a while." Margaret set her cup down. "You'll learn that soon enough, teaching in a place like Millbrook." "Just watch yourself with that Vance boy," she said instead. "His father sits on the board. People around here tend to look the other way when it comes to that family." Claire nodded slowly. "I noticed the plaque in the front hall," she said. "Everybody notices that plaque." Margaret finished her coffee and stood to leave. At the door, she paused. "You remind me of someone," she said. "Can't place who. Something about the way you carry yourself." Claire gave her a small smile and said nothing. Margaret shrugged and left, and the faculty lounge went quiet again. The second class of the day was Tyler's again. Wellness and fitness met 3 times a week, and the students spent that Wednesday session out on the gym floor running drills, working through basic conditioning. Claire stood at the center of the room giving instructions, demonstrating footwork for a simple agility drill, her movements clean and economical, in a way that most gym teachers never bothered with. Tyler hung near the back with his 2 friends Deacon and Cole, doing just enough to avoid getting called out no more. At one point during a partner drill, a soccer ball rolled loose from the equipment bin by the wall. Tyler picked it up. He waited until Claire's back was turned, walked toward her, and kicked it as hard as he could straight at her. It happened fast. Most people in that gym only saw the blur of it. Claire moved. Not a jump, not a flinch, a small shift of her weight, a turn of her hip, and the ball skimmed past her shoulder and bounced harmlessly off the wall behind her. She didn't even look surprised. She turned around, calm, and looked at Tyler. He stood there for a second, caught his grin faltering just slightly. One student in the back row had seen the whole thing clearly. His name was Ellis Monroe, 34 years old, a returning student, the kind of man who sat in the back of every classroom he ever walked into out of habit more than choice. Ellis had gone back to school after his divorce, after losing the job he'd held for 11 years when the plant closed down. He was trying to finish a degree he'd started in his 20s and never completed, back before life had a chance to reroute him twice over. He was older than most of his classmates, quieter than most of them too. He watched Claire dodge that ball, and something in the way she moved struck him. It wasn't luck. It was practiced, precise, the kind of movement that gets trained into a body over years, not something you pick up by accident. He didn't say anything about it, not that day, but he noticed. Claire walked over, picked up the ball, and tossed it gently back into the equipment bin. "Watch where that goes next time," she said to Tyler. Not loud, not angry. "My bad, Teach," Tyler said, grinning, holding both hands up like he was innocent. "You still have a chance to step back from this," Claire said. She said it quiet enough that only he and his 2 friends heard it clearly. Tyler laughed it off. "Step back from what?" he said. "It's a soccer ball." Claire didn't answer that. She walked back to the front of the gym and kept teaching the rest of the class, passing without incident, though the air in the room felt a little different than it had an hour earlier. Ellis Monroe stayed behind after class that day, pretending to tie his shoe by the bleachers, waiting until most of the students had cleared out. When it was just him and Claire left in the gym, he walked over. "That was a nice move," he said. "With the ball?" Claire looked at him, a little surprised. "Lucky reflexes," she said. Ellis shook his head slowly. "I used to box a little years ago. Nothing serious. Gym class stuff back in my 20s. He shrugged. "That wasn't luck. That was training." Claire held his gaze for a moment. "You've got a good eye," she said, and left it at that. Ellis nodded, understanding that the conversation was closed, at least for now. "Anyway," he said, "thanks for the class today. First one in a while I didn't feel like the oldest guy in the room got laughed at." Claire tilted her head slightly. "That happen a lot? Getting laughed at?" Ellis shrugged the kind of shrug that carried more weight than it let on. "More than you'd think," he said. You get to be 34, sitting in a classroom next to 18-year-olds. Some of them figure you're either a joke or a cautionary tale. Not many bother finding out different. I don't think either one, Claire said. I know, Ellis said. That's why I said thanks. He picked up his bag and walked out, and Claire stood alone in the empty gymnasium holding the whistle in her hand. She looked down at it, ran her thumb over the small dent on the side, and for just a moment her mind went somewhere else entirely. That evening, Claire drove home to the small rented house on the edge of town, the one she'd moved into just 6 weeks earlier. It was quiet inside, just her. She set her bag down by the door and walked straight to the hall closet. On the top shelf sat a wooden box, plain, unmarked, the kind of box that looks like nothing special until you open it. She pulled it down and carried it to the kitchen table. Inside, wrapped in an old towel, sat a pair of boxing gloves, red leather, cracked with age, the laces frayed at the ends. Underneath them, a photograph. A younger Claire, maybe 19, standing in athletic gear, a medal around her neck, and beside her, a tall man with graying hair and a proud, tired smile. Her father. Coach Bennett, that's what most of Millbrook used to call him back when the community gym downtown was still open, back when half the kids in this town learned to throw a jab in his ring before they learned to drive a car. He had trained boxers for almost 30 years out of that gym, amateur fighters mostly, a few who went on to real careers, most who just learned discipline and left with something steadier inside them than what they walked in with. Claire had been his last student, and his best one. She started training with him at 7 years old, sweeping the gym floor in exchange for lessons too small at first to even wrap her own hands properly. By 19, she held the state amateur title in her weight class, the youngest fighter in the state to win it. They called her the Millbrook Southpaw back then, a nickname that stuck around the gym long after she stopped fighting. She stopped fighting 2 years ago. Her father got sick that spring. Fast, the kind of sick that doesn't leave much time for goodbyes. In the hospital near the end, he held her hand and made her promise him something. Don't use your fists to prove anything anymore, he told her. Teach people how to stand up instead. That's a better fight, and it lasts longer. She promised him. She kept the gloves, she kept the medal. She kept the whistle he used to wear around his own neck during every single practice, every single fight night for 30 years straight, rain or shine, good years and lean ones alike. And she kept the promise. She thought back to her first year in that ring, 7 years old, barely tall enough to see over the ropes. Her father used to lift her up onto the apron just so she could watch the older fighters spar. Watch their feet, he'd tell her, not their fists. The feet tell you everything a person's about to do. She learned to read people that way. Not just in the ring, everywhere. She had read Tyler Vance the moment he walked into her classroom. The set of his shoulders, the way his eyes moved around a room, always checking who was watching him, never checking who he might be hurting. Boys like that weren't born mean, her father used to say. They got built that way piece by piece, usually by somebody bigger than them who never once bothered correcting the pattern. She wondered briefly who had built Tyler Vance. She didn't know yet how close to home that question would land. She wrapped the gloves back in the towel, closed the box, and sat at the kitchen table for a long while just looking at the photograph. Outside, the street lights flickered on, one after another down the block. Inside, Claire Bennett sat with her father's whistle in one hand and a promise in her chest, and thought about a boy named Tyler Vance who had no idea what he had picked a fight with. Not that she planned to tell him. Some things you don't explain, you just live them. Across town in a small brick building that used to be Millbrook's most beloved gym, an old man sat alone in the dark. Walt Higgins had worked as the maintenance and security man at Millbrook Community College for going on 15 years now. Before that, he'd spent 20 years in the Army, and before that, he'd grown up 3 blocks from the very gym he now stood inside of. The Millbrook Community Boxing Gym. Painted letters, half faded, still visible above the front door if you knew to look for them. Walt had watched this building go quiet year by year, and it never got easier to walk past it. It hadn't held a real class in almost 3 years, not since Coach Bennett passed. The equipment sat gathering dust. The heavy bags hung still. The ring in the center of the room had gone quiet, the canvas gray with age, the ropes slack and sun-faded near the corners. The college had taken over the lease on the building 2 years back, mostly to use it for storage. Walt kept a key. Nobody questioned why an old maintenance man still came by some evenings to sweep the floor of a gym nobody used anymore. That night, though, someone else was there. Walt had come by to check on a leaking pipe near the back wall. He flipped on the lights and stopped in the doorway. Claire Bennett stood in the center of the ring, gloves on, working combinations against the old heavy bag, alone in the quiet. She hadn't heard him come in. He watched her for a long moment before she noticed him. Her form was clean, fast, controlled, the kind of movement that takes years to build and never fully leaves a person even after they stop. Walt felt something catch in his chest. He knew that stance. He had watched a man teach that exact stance to dozens of young fighters over 30 years, right here in this room, correcting elbows, adjusting stances, calling out encouragement in a voice that carried clean across the whole building. "Bennett," he said quietly, almost to himself. Claire turned, startled, gloves still up out of instinct. When she saw who it was, she lowered them. "Mr. Higgins," she said. "I'm sorry, I didn't think anyone still used this building." "Nobody does," Walt said, "except me some nights. And apparently you." He walked further into the room, looking around at the old equipment, the ring, the faded posters still taped to the far wall, announcements for fight nights that happened years ago, the ink gone soft with age. "You're Coach Bennett's girl," he said. It wasn't really a question. Claire pulled off one glove, slow. "You knew my father?" Walt let out a short laugh, more breath than sound. "Knew him, sparred with him, buried more than a few Friday nights in this ring, arguing with him about strategy." He shook his head. "Man taught half this town how to throw a punch, and the other half how to take one without falling apart." Claire's eyes softened. "He didn't talk about the gym much near the end," she said. "Things got complicated with the funding. The college took over the building not long before he passed." Walt's jaw tightened slightly at that, though he said nothing more about it, not yet. "You still train?" he asked instead. "Not really," Claire said. "Not since he died. I made him a promise." "What kind of promise?" Claire looked at the heavy bag at her own gloved hand. "To stop fighting to prove things. To teach instead." She shrugged. "I got a job at the college, fitness instructor, trying to keep that promise." Walt studied her for a long moment. "That why you didn't put a young fool in his place today when he grabbed something that wasn't his to grab?" Claire's head snapped up. "You heard about that already?" "Small campus," Walt said, echoing Margaret's words from earlier that day without knowing it. "News travels." Claire pulled off her other glove. "I didn't want to make it worse," she said. "For me or for him?" Walt nodded slowly, like he understood more than he was saying. "Your father used to say something," he said, "about patience. You remember it?" Claire thought for a moment. "He said a lot of things." "He used to say, the man who throws the first punch usually loses the fight even when he wins it." Walt's eyes went distant for a second. "Took me years to understand what he meant by that." Claire was quiet. "I think I understand it now," she said finally. Walt looked around the old gym once more, at the dust, at the silence, at everything this place used to be. "Shame what happened to this building," he said, almost under his breath. "What do you mean?" Walt hesitated. "Long story," he said. "Older than you'd think. Goes back further than your father, further than most folks around here remember." Claire waited for him to say more. He didn't, not that night. "Get some rest," Walt said instead, softer now. "And Claire, be careful with that Vance boy. His father's got a long reach in this town. Longer than most people realize." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Your father would be proud of the restraint you showed today," he said. "But restraint only holds a person so long. Eventually, the truth finds its own way out." He left her alone with those words, and the quiet gym, and the ghost of her father hanging in the still air around the old ring. The next morning, 3 miles across town, the Board of Trustees for Millbrook Community College gathered for their monthly meeting. Richard Vance sat at the head of the table as he always did. 61 years old, silver-haired, a tailored suit that looked out of place in a room full of folding chairs and stale coffee. He owned 3 car dealerships across the county. He'd sat on the board for over a decade. His name was on more than one building on that campus, carved into stone polished twice a year. Today's meeting had one item that mattered to him more than the rest. The old community boxing gym, the building the college had absorbed 2 years earlier, sat unused, costing the school money in upkeep and insurance every single month. Richard proposed selling the lot, turning it into additional parking, a practical decision he called it, nothing personal. Margaret Doyle, who also served on the faculty advisory committee, spoke up from her seat near the back. "That gym meant something to this town," she said. "Coach Bennett trained 3 generations of kids in that building, free of charge, most of them." Richard's expression flickered just slightly at the mention of that name. "Sentiment doesn't pay the electric bill, Margaret," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. "The building's a liability sitting empty. It's time this board made a practical decision instead of a nostalgic one." Margaret pressed further. "There are people in this town who still remember what that gym gave them. Some of them owe more to that place than they'd probably ever admit out loud." Richard's hand tightened slightly around his pen. "The vote will happen at the Legacy Night event in 2 weeks, he said, moving the conversation forward before anyone could dig any deeper. "The board will decide the future of that property then, alongside the rest of the evening's business." Nobody in that room noticed the small, tight breath Richard Vance let out after he said it. Nobody except, perhaps, Margaret, who had known him for 20 years, and who thought not for the first time that there was something underneath Richard Vance's calm surface that never quite sat right. She remembered him from years back, long before the suits and the dealerships and the plaques with his name on them. She remembered a much younger Richard Vance, thinner, quieter, standing outside the old community gym on Saturday mornings, waiting for it to open. She hadn't thought about that in years. It surprised her how clearly it came back. She didn't say anything about it in the meeting, it wasn't the time, but she watched him gather his papers a little too quickly when the meeting ended, watched him avoid the eyes of anyone who might ask a question he didn't want to answer. She didn't know what it was yet, but she intended to find out. Richard Vance drove home that evening with both hands tight on the wheel longer than the drive should have taken him. He passed the old gym on the way he always did, and the way he always tried not to look at it, and failed the way he always failed. He thought about a name he hadn't said out loud in years. He pushed the thought down the way he'd learned to push most things down, and kept driving. At home, he poured himself a drink he didn't finish and sat in his study long after the house had gone dark around him. Somewhere upstairs, his son was already asleep, dreaming whatever 18-year-olds dream about, unaware of the weight his father carried quietly through every single day, unaware of how much of that weight had started decades ago in a small gym across town that neither of them had set foot in for years. Richard told himself, the way he always did, that the past stayed in the past if you simply refused to look at it. He was about to learn how wrong that had always been. That same evening in a large house on the nicer side of Millbrook, Tyler Vance sat across the dinner table from his father. Richard Vance ate in silence for the first few minutes, the way he usually did, scrolling through something on his phone between bites. "Coach says your numbers are down," Richard finally said, not looking up. "Practice scores. Grades, too, from what I hear." Tyler pushed food around his plate. "It's one class," he said. "Some new fitness instructor. Doesn't even know how to run a gym properly." Richard set his phone down. "I don't pay this family's way so you can coast through a required course," he said. "You understand what if your grades slip below the wrestling program's minimum? You understand what that costs this family, publicly?" Tyler's jaw tightened. "I get it," he said. "Do you?" Richard leaned back in his chair, studying his son the way he studied a bad contract. Everything you have, every advantage, it comes with expectations attached. You don't get to just exist in this town, Tyler. You represent something. I know, Dad. Then act like it. The conversation ended there, the way most of their conversations did lately, clipped short before it could turn into anything real. Tyler excused himself and went upstairs, the weight of his father's expectations settling over him the same way it always did. Heavy, familiar, impossible to put down. He didn't think about the whistle he'd thrown to the gym floor that morning. Not really. He thought about wrestling scores and grade minimums and a father who measured love in performance metrics. Somewhere underneath all that pressure sat something smaller and sadder, something Tyler himself couldn't have named if you'd asked him directly. He just knew that when he made someone else feel small for a few minutes, he didn't feel quite so small himself. It wasn't an excuse. It never would be. But it was a reason, and reasons, Claire's father used to say, are usually hiding somewhere behind even the ugliest behavior, waiting for somebody patient enough to go looking for them. By that afternoon the day before, word of the whistle incident had already spread through the student body, the way things do on a small campus, mouth to mouth, exaggerated a little more with each telling. Tyler and his friends had turned it into a joke, a video clip recorded on someone's phone during the first few seconds of the class, before the whistle grab edited together with mocking captions and passed around in a group chat. By evening, dozens of students on campus had seen it. Claire didn't know about it yet. Ellis Monroe did. He sat in his small apartment that night scrolling through his phone and saw the clip pop up, shared by a classmate. He watched it twice, feeling a low simmer of anger build in his chest. He thought about mentioning it to someone, the dean, maybe, or Claire herself. He decided against it for now, not because he didn't care, because he understood better than most what it felt like to be laughed at by people half his age, and he knew that sometimes stepping in too early only made things worse for the person you were trying to protect. He set the phone down and told himself he'd keep watching, keep paying attention. If it got worse, he'd say something. He thought about his own daughter, 11 years old, living 2 states away now with her mother since the divorce. He thought about the kind of man he wanted her to see, if she ever looked hard enough. Not a man who stayed quiet every single time, but not a man who charged in without thinking either. He'd spent 11 years on a factory floor learning that lesson the hard way, watching men lose good jobs over fights that solved nothing. Pick your moment, his own father used to tell him. Anybody can throw a punch. Takes a smarter man to know when one's actually worth throwing. He believed that, most days anyway. Tonight, watching that video for a 3rd time, he wasn't so sure patience was the right answer anymore. He didn't know yet how right he was to worry. The following morning, Ellis walked into the gymnasium a few minutes early, the way he usually did, and found Tyler and his 2 friends already there, gathered near the equipment room. They were talking to Sully, the heavyset student from the class, who tended to laugh along with whatever Tyler said, more out of habit than conviction. As Ellis passed by, one of Tyler's friends muttered something under his breath, loud enough for Ellis to hear clearly. Something about how the school should really be charging tuition by decade instead of by credit hour. The others laughed. Sully's laugh came a half-second late, thinner than the rest. Ellis kept walking, didn't turn around, didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But it landed anyway. He took his usual seat in the back row and set his bag down harder than he meant to. Claire walked in a few minutes later, whistle back around her neck, a fresh cord tied through the loop, replacing the one Tyler had snapped 2 days earlier. She noticed it immediately, the shift in the room. The way Ellis sat a little stiffer than usual, the way Tyler and his friends kept glancing over, grinning about something. She didn't ask what had happened. Not yet. She started class, same as always, calm, steady, giving nothing away. Partway through the session, during a stretching exercise, Tyler made a comment loud enough for the whole room to hear, aimed directly at Ellis. Something about how it must be nice to relive your college years twice because you wasted the first shot. A few students laughed, nervous laughter, the kind that comes from not knowing whether it's safe to stay quiet or, worse, to laugh along. Ellis's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Claire stopped mid-instruction. She turned and looked directly at Tyler. "That's enough," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Tyler held up his hands, that same lazy grin on his face. "Just making conversation, Teach." "Not in my class, you're not," Claire said. "Not like that." For a moment, the whole gym went still. Tyler's grin faltered just slightly the way it had 2 days earlier when the ball missed her by inches. He didn't push it further, not that day. But something had shifted between them, and everyone in that room felt it settle into the air like the moment before a storm breaks. After class, Claire found Ellis by the bleachers again, gathering his things. "You all right?" she asked. Ellis nodded, though the tightness around his eyes said otherwise. "I'm used to it," he said. "People like that, they've been laughing at people like me my whole life. Guess I thought, coming back to school at my age, I'd finally shake it." Claire sat down on the edge of the bleachers, not across from him, but beside him. "You didn't waste your first shot," she said quietly. "You're here now. That's not nothing." Ellis looked at her, surprised by the directness of it. "That's a nice thing to say." "It's not just a nice thing," Claire said. "It's true. I've watched plenty of people who never had the guts to come back and try again. Takes more than most folks understand." Ellis was quiet a moment, looking out at the empty gym floor. "I had a foreman like that once," he said, "back at the plant. Thought pushing people around made him look bigger. Took years before anybody finally called him on it." "What happened to him?" "Lost his job eventually. Same way most bullies do, sooner or later. They push too far, and the ground gives out from under them." He shrugged. "Just takes time, sometimes more time than seems fair." "You've got a strange way about you, Teach," he said finally. "Calm. Real calm. Even when that kid's pushing every button he can find." Claire smiled faintly. "My father used to tell me something," she said. "The loudest person in the room isn't always the strongest one in it." Ellis considered that. "Smart man, your father." "He was," Claire said, and something in her voice made it clear the word was heavier than it sounded. Ellis didn't push. He just nodded, picked up his bag, and stood. "For what it's worth," he said, "that kid's gonna keep pushing until somebody stops him. And it might not be somebody as patient as you." Claire watched him walk toward the door. "I know," she said, quiet enough that maybe he didn't even hear it. She sat alone in the gym a while longer after that, the whistle resting against her collarbone, her father's voice echoing somewhere in the back of her mind. "Teach people how to stand up instead. That's a better fight, and it lasts longer." She believed that. She still believed it, but some part of her, some old familiar part she had tried hard to put away 2 years ago, wondered how much longer patience alone would hold this particular line. That evening, as Claire packed up her bag to head home, there was a knock at the gymnasium office door. She looked up expecting Margaret or maybe a student with a question about the syllabus. Instead, Walt Higgins stood in the doorway, holding something in his hands. An old leather notebook, the cover cracked and worn soft with age. "Got a minute?" he asked. Claire set her bag down slowly. "Of course." Walt stepped into the office, closed the door behind him, quiet, careful, like the walls themselves might be listening. He held the notebook out to her. "This was your father's," he said. "He gave it to me for safekeeping a long while back before he got sick. Told me to hold on to it. Told me I'd know when it was time to pass it along." Claire took the notebook slowly, her fingers brushing over the worn leather. "What is it?" Walt was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "There's a lot in there," he said, "about the gym, about the people he trained over the years. About one particular fella back when your daddy was just starting out teaching kids for free out of a garage before the real gym ever existed." Claire looked up at him. "Walt, what are you talking about?" Walt met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something heavy sitting behind his calm expression, something he'd carried a long while. "There's a name in there you're going to recognize," he said. "And once you read it, some things about this town, about that boy in your class, and about his daddy sitting on the college board are going to start making a whole lot more sense." Claire's hand tightened around the notebook. "Whose name?" Walt looked toward the door, as if making sure they were still alone, then back at her. "I think it's better you read it yourself," he said. Some things land harder coming from a page than from a man's mouth. He turned to leave, then paused, his hand on the doorframe. "Your daddy always said the truth has a way of finding daylight eventually," he said. "Looks like it's about time it did." He walked out, leaving Claire alone in the small office, the notebook heavy in her hands, heavier than its size should have allowed. She looked down at the worn leather cover, at her father's initials pressed faintly into the corner. Outside, the sun had started to set over Millbrook, the same quiet town it had always been. But something was shifting beneath its surface, slow and steady, like a fighter circling before the first real punch of the night. Claire sat down at the small desk in the corner of the office and opened the notebook to its first page. Her father's handwriting greeted her familiar slanted, the same handwriting that used to fill out her training logs when she was a girl. The first few pages were nothing unusual, notes on early students, sparring records, a list of donors who'd helped keep the gym running back in its leanest years. Then, near the bottom of the third page, one name stopped her cold. She read it twice, just to be sure her eyes weren't playing tricks on her in the dim office light. Richard, age 14, no money for gloves, gave him my old pair. Kid's got more heart than fear in him. Going to make something of himself one day if somebody just gives him the chance nobody else will. Claire sat back slowly in her chair. There was no last name written, not yet. But something in her chest already knew the way a fighter knows a punch is coming before it ever lands. She turned the page, hands not quite steady anymore, and kept reading, the whistle resting cool against her collarbone. Her father's voice somehow louder in her mind than it had been in 2 long years. Outside the office window, the parking lot lights flickered on one by one across the empty campus, and somewhere across town, in a house far too large for the quiet that lived inside it, Richard Vance sat alone in his study, staring at an old photograph he kept locked in the bottom drawer of his desk, a photograph of a gym that didn't exist in the same way anymore. A photograph of a much younger version of himself standing beside a man he had once called the only person who ever believed in him, for free. Neither of them knew it yet, not fully, but 2 threads that had been pulled apart years ago were slowly, carefully being drawn back together. And somewhere in that quiet town, an old promise made in a hospital room 2 years earlier was about to be tested in ways Claire Bennett never could have imagined. On the morning she walked into that gymnasium with a whistle around her neck and a whole town's worth of secrets waiting just beneath the surface. Some stories sit quiet for years. They wait in old notebooks, in locked drawers, in the corners of a person's memory they've trained themselves not to visit. They wait behind polished smiles and tailored suits, behind plaques on hallway walls, behind every careful word a man chooses when he's spent decades making sure nobody asks him the wrong question. Then one night somebody opens the wrong page, and everything starts moving again. This is where Claire Bennett's story picks back up. She read through the night. The office chair grew uncomfortable somewhere around midnight, and she barely noticed. Her father's handwriting filled page after page, some entries just a few lines, some running on for most of a page, all of it written in the same steady hand she remembered from her childhood training logs. That first line, she'd already seen the one about a boy named Richard, 14 years old, no money for gloves, given her father's old pair, stayed with her as she kept reading. Her father had noticed him. That much was clear from every page that followed. Claire turned the pages slowly. Over the following months, the entries grew warmer. Richard's first sparring session, clumsy but eager. Richard's first real fight, a scrappy amateur bout he lost on points but walked away from with his head held high, grinning like he'd won anyway. Richard staying late to help sweep the gym floor, refusing to take money for it, telling Coach Bennett he'd rather earn his lessons than be handed them. "He doesn't have a father worth mentioning," one entry said, plain and simple. "Figure the least I can do is show up where somebody else didn't." Claire felt her throat tighten reading that line. She kept going. The entries continued for nearly 3 years, Richard's name appearing again and again, each time with a little more pride behind the words. Her father had clearly loved training that boy, the way a man loves watching something grow that he planted himself. There was a page describing Richard's high school graduation, her father sitting in the back row of the auditorium because Richard's own mother had to work a double shift that day and couldn't make it. Boy looked out at the crowd during the ceremony, the entry read, and I was the only face he knew out there. Stood up and clapped loud enough for 2 people. Figured somebody ought to. Then near the middle of the notebook, the tone shifted, an entry dated years later, the handwriting a little shakier now, the ink a little more faded, the sentences shorter, like something in the writing itself had gotten tired. Richard came by the gym today. Different man now. Suit, car, worth more than this whole building. Didn't recognize the boy I used to know in him at all. Claire's stomach dropped. She turned the page. Asked him for help with the roof repairs. Just a loan, nothing more, something I could pay back over time. He said the gym wasn't a good investment anymore, said this town had moved past needing a place like this. Another entry a few months after that one, the handwriting even smaller, cramped into the corner of the page, as if the words themselves had wanted to take up less room. Board's talking about raising our lease. Been trying to reach Richard since he's got a seat on that board now. No returned calls. Claire sat back for a moment, letting that settle. She thought about every polished handshake she'd seen Richard Vance give at town events over the years, the ones she'd watched from a distance as a teenager. Never once knowing the man behind them, had once slept some nights on the gym's old couch when things got bad at home. She kept reading. And then, near the final pages, a shorter entry, the handwriting barely holding steady. Lost the lease fight today. Jim's future uncertain. Man I helped raise sat 2 seats down from the board chairman and said nothing when they voted against us. Not a word. Claire read it a 3rd time, as if repetition might change what it said. It didn't. She thought about her father in his final years, still teaching a handful of kids out of that gym, even after the board vote, refusing to fully let it go, patching the roof himself with materials he could barely afford, never once telling her the real reason why. He'd carried that betrayal in silence, the same way he'd taught her to carry pain in the ring, quiet, controlled, never letting the other side see exactly where it landed. She thought about all the times she'd asked him as a teenager why he looked so tired lately, why the gym felt emptier some weeks than others, and how he'd always brushed it off with the same worn answer. Just business, nothing to worry about. She understood now what that answer had actually cost him. The very last entry in the notebook was dated only a few weeks before he got sick. Gym's closing for good come spring. Told Claire it's just money troubles. Didn't tell her the rest. No sense passing a grudge down to a daughter who never asked for it. Some weights a man's supposed to carry himself. Claire closed the notebook. She sat there for a long moment, the office silent around her, the whistle cold now against her collarbone. She thought about Tyler Vance standing in her classroom, grinning, grabbing that whistle off her neck like it was nothing. Richard Vance's son. The pieces settled into place slowly, the way a bruise darkens over a day or two, invisible at first, undeniable eventually. The next morning, Claire found Walt in the maintenance office before her first class, a cup of coffee in each hand. She set one down in front of him and sat across the desk. "I read it," she said. "All of it." Walt nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting this conversation for a while now. "Figured you would." "Richard Vance," Claire said. "Tyler's father? My dad basically raised him in that ring." "That's about the shape of it," Walt said. And when Dad needed help years later, Richard turned his back. Walt was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the desk. "It's more complicated than turning his back," he said, "though I understand why it looks that way from where you're sitting." "Then explain it to me." Walt sighed, long and tired, the kind of sigh that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time. "Richard grew up with nothing," he said. "Father drank himself out of that family before Richard turned 10. Mother worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. Your daddy was about the only steady thing that boy ever had." "So what happened?" Success happen, Walt said. Man claws his way up from nothing. Sometimes he gets so scared of falling back down he starts cutting away anything that reminds him where he came from. Even the good things. Especially the good things, sometimes. Claire frowned. That doesn't excuse it. Never said it did, Walt replied. Just explaining it. There's a difference between an excuse and a reason. Your daddy used to say that same thing, if I remember right. Claire's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. He carried that hurt for years, she said quietly. Never once told me why the gym really closed, just said things got complicated. Your daddy wasn't the type to burden his own daughter with bitterness, Walt said. That wasn't his way. He'd rather carry a weight himself than pass it along to somebody he loved. Claire looked down at the notebook sitting on the desk between them. Why now, Walt? Why show me this now? Walt met her eyes. Because that boy in your class is heading down the same road his father walked, he said. Difference is, Richard didn't have anybody around who understood where that road leads. You do. Claire sat with that for a long moment. I'm not trying to save Tyler Vance, she said finally. I'm just trying to teach a fitness class without getting my whistle thrown across the gym floor. Walt almost smiled at that. Maybe, he said. Or maybe you're standing exactly where your daddy stood 30 years ago, whether you meant to end up there or not. He stood gathering his own coffee cup and paused at the door. Either way, he said, watch yourself around Richard Vance. Guilt makes a man dangerous, sometimes more dangerous than anger ever could. A guilty man's got something to protect, and men like that don't always fight fair. He left her alone with those words and the notebook and a picture of Richard Vance that no longer matched the polished man she'd seen a photograph of in the local paper the week before. Claire sat in the maintenance office a while longer after Walt left, turning the notebook over in her hands. She thought about her own students, the ones who came to class exhausted from double shifts, the ones who apologized for showing up late because a car had broken down or a kid had gotten sick or life had simply gotten in the way again. She wondered how many of them were quietly carrying the same kind of weight Richard Vance had carried at 14, and what kind of man they might become 20 years from now, depending on who happened to notice them along the way. It didn't excuse what Tyler's father had done, but it gave the whole story a shape she hadn't expected, softer at the edges than the anger she'd walked in with that morning. Tyler Vance had no idea any of this history existed. He didn't know his father had once swept a gym floor for free lessons. He didn't know the man who raised him had spent years quietly ashamed of a decision made at a boardroom table, a decision that helped bury a building that mattered to half the town. All Tyler knew was pressure, grades slipping, wrestling scores down, a father who measured love in performance numbers and had made that clear again over dinner just a few nights back, and a new teacher who wasn't backing down the way teachers usually did when Tyler decided to make their lives difficult. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Most teachers folded eventually, reported him to the dean or complained to his coach or at the very least raised their voice enough to give him the reaction he was fishing for. Claire Bennett gave him nothing. No fear, no anger, just that same calm, steady voice telling him he still had a chance to step back. It made him feel small in a way he didn't have words for, so he decided to make her feel smaller first. The plan started simple enough, at least in Tyler's mind. He and his two friends, Deacon and Cole, sat in the campus parking lot after practice one evening. Tyler scrolling back through old footage on his phone looking for something he could bend into a different shape. She grabbed my arm last week, Tyler said, half convincing himself as he said it. During that drill thing. Yanked me pretty hard, actually. Deacon raised an eyebrow. She didn't grab you. You tripped over the cone. Doesn't matter how it looked, Tyler said. Matters how it plays. He found a few seconds of footage from a partner drill, a moment where Claire had reached out to correct his stance, her hand briefly on his shoulder. Standard instruction, nothing more. He trimmed it, slowed it down, added a caption that twisted the moment into something it never was. Teacher getting physical with students. Anybody else notice this? Cole looked over his shoulder at the screen, uneasy. You sure about this, man? Feels like a lot for a whistle joke. It's not about the whistle anymore, Tyler said. It's about her thinking she can talk to me like that in front of everybody. He didn't post it publicly, not yet. He sent it privately first to a small group chat, then to his father's assistant at the dealership office, framed as a concern rather than a scheme. By the next morning, the message had made its way quietly, carefully, into the hands of the college dean. Claire found out about the complaint on a Thursday morning, called into the dean's office before her first class even started. Dean Whitfield sat behind his desk, a heavyset man in his 50s who had run this campus for nearly a decade. Careful, cautious, the kind of administrator who avoided conflict whenever conflict could be avoided. We've received a complaint, he said, sliding a printed still frame across the desk. A student alleges inappropriate physical contact during a fitness class. Claire looked at the image. A blurry moment, her hand on Tyler's shoulder, the context stripped away entirely. That's from a stretching correction, she said. Standard instruction. I can walk you through the full unedited footage if the security system still has it. We're looking into that, Whitfield said, not quite meeting her eyes. In the meantime, given the seriousness of the allegation, and given who filed it, the board feels it's best if you're placed on administrative leave while we investigate. Claire felt something cold settle in her chest. Given who filed it, she repeated. Meaning Tyler Vance, meaning Richard Vance's son. Whitfield didn't answer that directly. This is procedure, he said instead, nothing personal. You'll continue to receive pay during the review. It shouldn't take longer than 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Claire did the math instantly. 2 weeks put the resolution right around Legacy Night, right around the very meeting where the fate of her father's gym would be decided. That timing didn't feel like coincidence. I'd like to see the full security footage, she said, the unedited version. That request has been submitted, Whitfield said. IT is looking into it. Something in the way he said it told Claire the request wasn't moving quickly and might not move at all. Dean Whitfield, she said, choosing her words carefully, I understand procedure matters. But procedure shouldn't mean guilty until proven innocent, not for a teacher with no prior complaints, no history of anything like this. Whitfield rubbed at his temple, a tired gesture. Off the record, he said, lowering his voice slightly. I don't love how fast this moved either. But when a board member's family is involved, the process gets handled a certain way around here. Has for as long as I've worked this campus. That's not justice, Claire said. That's just power. Sometimes, Whitfield admitted, those things look identical from where I'm sitting. He slid a folder across the desk, a formal notice of administrative leave effective immediately. I am sorry, he added, and for a moment Claire believed him. Get through the review. Let the footage speak for itself once it surfaces. If it surfaces, Claire said. Whitfield didn't argue with that. She left his office 10 minutes later without her classroom keys, without her campus badge, and without the whistle around her neck which she'd taken off that morning and left sitting on her kitchen table, almost as if some part of her already knew she wouldn't be needing it that day. Word of Claire's suspension spread through campus fast. By lunchtime, most students had heard some version of the story, most of them wrong, most of them favoring Tyler's telling, since it had gotten there first. Ellis Monroe heard it secondhand from another student in the hallway and felt something twist hard in his gut. He'd seen that stretching correction happen with his own eyes. Nothing about it had looked wrong, not for a single second. He thought about saying something, going to the dean directly, but he had no official standing, no security footage, nothing but his own word against a story that already had momentum behind it. He decided to wait, watch, gather what he could. He wasn't the only one paying closer attention now. Sully, the heavy-set wrestling teammate who usually laughed along with whatever Tyler said, sat in the locker room later that day, quiet, chewing on something that didn't sit right with him. He'd been in the gym during that drill. He remembered it clearly. Claire's hand had barely touched Tyler's shoulder, guiding his stance for maybe 2 seconds. Standard correction, the kind every instructor made a dozen times a class. He'd also seen the video Tyler sent around the group chat, recognized immediately how much had been cut away, how the slowed footage twisted something ordinary into something it wasn't. He hadn't said anything at the time, just laughed along with the others the way he always did. Sitting alone now, he felt the weight of that silence differently. He thought back to his own freshman year, 3 years earlier, when an upperclassman had spread a rumor about him that wasn't true. Something small and stupid, but it had followed him around campus for months anyway, whispered behind his back in the cafeteria, in the locker room, everywhere he went. Nobody had stood up for him then either. He remembered how it felt knowing people believed a lie simply because nobody bothered correcting it. He looked across the locker room at Tyler laughing with Deacon and Cole about something unrelated, easy and unbothered, like the last few days hadn't cost anyone anything at all. Sully thought about saying something right then, standing up, walking over, telling them all what he actually remembered from that drill. He didn't. Not yet. "You all right?" Deacon asked, catching him staring at nothing. "Fine," Sully said. He wasn't fine, not really, but he didn't say anything else that day either. Margaret Doyle heard about Claire's suspension from another faculty member during her free period and marched straight to the IT office before her afternoon class even started. She found a young technician named Priya reviewing a ticket queue, the request for the unedited security footage sitting near the bottom of the list, unassigned. "This needs to move faster," Margaret said, pointing at the screen. "A teacher's employment is riding on this." "I got a note from administration to hold off," Priya said, apologetic but firm. "Said the review process needed to go through proper channels first." "Whose note?" Priya hesitated. "It came down from the dean's office, attached to a memo from a board member." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Richard Vance," she said, not really asking. Priya didn't confirm it directly, but her expression did the confirming for her. Margaret thanked her and left, walking briskly back toward her classroom, already turning over ideas in her mind. If the official channels wouldn't move quickly enough, she'd find another way to get that footage seen before it mattered too late. That afternoon, during her free period, she called an old friend, a retired teacher named Frank Delgado, who now sat on the board of trustees alongside Richard Vance. Frank had taught history at Millbrook for 31 years before retiring, and he'd known Coach Bennett personally back when the two of them used to grab coffee most Sunday mornings at the diner on Main Street. "Frank," Margaret said once he picked up, "I need a favor, and I need you to trust me on this one without asking too many questions yet." "That's usually when I ask the most questions," Frank said, though there was warmth in his voice. "There's a teacher on leave right now over a complaint I don't believe for 1 second, Margaret said. "And there's security footage sitting in a queue that isn't moving fast enough. I think somebody's stalling it on purpose." Frank was quiet for a moment. "Richard," he said, not really asking. "I can't prove that yet," Margaret said, "but I intend to." "I'll make some calls," Frank said. "See if I can push that footage request through official board channels instead of waiting on IT's queue. Might carry more weight coming from a trustee." "Thank you, Frank." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Whatever's underneath all this, if it involves Richard the way you're hinting at, it's going to get uncomfortable before it gets resolved. That man doesn't like being questioned." "Neither do I," Margaret said, and hung up, already planning her next move. That evening, Claire sat in her kitchen, the whistle resting on the table in front of her, untouched since morning. She hadn't cried, not yet. She wasn't sure she would. Her father's voice kept circling back through her mind, the same lesson from years ago delivered after a hard loss in the ring. One of the only times she'd ever seen him truly disappointed in her performance, though never in her character. "You don't lose fights because you're weak," he'd told her that night. "You lose them because you stop trusting your own preparation the second things get difficult." She wasn't in a ring anymore, but the lesson still applied. A knock at her door pulled her out of the memory. Walt stood on her porch, his old truck idling in the driveway behind him. "Heard what happened," he said, stepping inside once she waved him in. Whole town's heard probably by now. They suspended me based on 2 seconds of edited video, Claire said. Timed perfectly to land right before Legacy Night. Walt nodded grimly. That's Richard's fingerprints all over it, he said. Man's always been good at making problems disappear quietly, long as somebody else takes the fall for it. You think he told Tyler to do this? Walt considered that carefully. Maybe not directly, he said, but that boy didn't learn how to bury the truth from a stranger. He learned it somewhere close to home. Claire looked down at the whistle again. I promised my father I'd stop fighting to prove things, she said quietly. I don't know how to prove any of this without breaking that promise. Walt sat down across from her, his old joints creaking as he lowered himself into the chair. Your daddy didn't mean stop standing up for what's right, he said. He meant stop using your fists to settle things fists were never built to settle. There's a difference, Claire, a big one. How do I know where that line sits? You already know, Walt said. You've known it your whole life. Questions whether you trust yourself enough to walk it. He stood to leave a few minutes later, pausing at the door the same way he had the night he'd brought her the notebook. There's still 6 days before Legacy Night, he said. That's enough time if we use it right. But we're going to need more than just the truth on our side. We're going to need proof nobody can argue with. He left her alone again, the porch light flickering above the door, the whole quiet street stretching out dark and still beyond it. Over the following days, the pressure on campus only grew heavier. Tyler, emboldened by how easily the first accusation had landed, grew bolder in the retelling of his story, adding small details each time, each version a little more dramatic than the last. Deacon and Cole backed him up without hesitation, the three of them presenting a unified front whenever anyone asked questions, though Cole's enthusiasm had started to wear thin around the edges, his answers growing shorter, less certain whenever a teacher pressed for specifics. Sully stayed quieter than usual, answering questions with as few words as possible, unable to fully commit to the story anymore, but not yet brave enough to contradict it either. Ellis kept his head down in the substitute instructor's class, taking mental notes, watching Tyler's confidence grow with every day Claire stayed away. He started keeping a small notebook of his own, jotting down dates, details, anything that might matter later, though he wasn't entirely sure yet what he was building toward. He wrote down the date of the original drill, the date the complaint surfaced, the timing of Claire's suspension, all of it lined up, a little too neatly for his liking. He also wrote down something else, a small detail he'd overheard in passing, Deacon mentioning offhand in the cafeteria that Tyler had been, quote-unquote, handling something, whatever that meant. Ellis underlined that phrase twice. He didn't know yet what he'd do with any of it, but 11 years on a factory floor had taught him one useful thing. Patience paid off eventually, as long as you kept your eyes open while you waited. Margaret worked her own angle, quietly, calling in old favors with 2 other board members she'd known for years, trying to slow down any final decision about the gym until the truth had a real chance to surface. Richard Vance, for his part, moved through those days with the practiced calm of a man used to controlling outcomes long before they ever became public. He told himself the situation was handled, contained, a minor inconvenience that would resolve itself before Legacy Night the way most inconveniences in his life eventually did, quietly, without consequence, without anyone asking too many questions. He did not yet understand how badly his son was about to make things worse. Alone in his study one of those nights, Richard poured himself a drink and sat with the framed photograph he kept hidden in his desk drawer. He thought about the man who'd handed him his first pair of gloves, thought about the gym floor he used to sweep at 14 years old, proud to do it, proud to earn something instead of being handed it. He thought about the day he'd told that man the gym wasn't worth saving. He remembered the look on Coach Bennett's face when he said it, not anger, something quieter and worse. Disappointment, the kind that doesn't argue back, the kind that just accepts the loss and walks away. Richard had told himself for years that it was simply business, practical. The gym cost money it couldn't earn back. Somebody on that board had to make the hard call. He never let himself sit with the truth underneath that explanation, that He'd been ashamed once he had money to be seen walking back into a gym that reminded everyone, including himself, exactly where he'd started. It was easier to call it business than to call it what it actually was. He poured another drink he didn't finish and told himself, the way he always did, that the past stayed buried if you simply refused to dig it up. He had no idea his own son was at that very moment only days away from digging through the wreckage of that exact past with his bare hands. 2 days before the break-in, Tyler sat alone in his room, staring at his phone, a message from his father's assistant sitting unread in his inbox. The board had scheduled an emergency session to review the security footage request Margaret had pushed through one of her contacts. If the original footage surfaced uncut, unedited, it would tell a very different story than the one Tyler had built. Panic set in fast. He thought about the trophy case in the old community gym building, the one the school used mostly for storage now. He remembered from a tour the wrestling team had taken there years earlier that the building's front entrance still ran on an old separate alarm system, one nobody had bothered updating in years. If any record from that older system somehow connected back to anything relevant, if any footage existed anywhere that could be traced back and cross-referenced with timestamps, it could unravel everything. It didn't fully make sense, not logically, not if he'd thought it through calmly, but panic rarely listens to logic. He lay awake most of that night, running through half-formed plans, each one worse than the last, none of them making him feel any less trapped. 4 days before Legacy Night, Tyler made his decision. He drove to the old gym after dark, parked 2 streets over, and walked the rest of the way, telling himself he just needed to check, just needed to be sure. Nothing in that building could cause him any trouble. He let himself in through a side door that hadn't locked properly in years, a detail every kid in town who'd ever snuck in to shoot hoops after hours already knew. Inside the building sat, dark and silent, the old ring, a pale shape in the moonlight coming through the high windows. He stood there a moment, listening to his own breathing, the silence of the place pressing in around him, heavier than he expected. Tyler moved toward the trophy case near the entrance, the one still holding old medals, old photographs, remnants of a gym that used to matter to this town. He didn't fully know what he was looking for, he just wanted it gone, all of it, anything that connected back to his father, to that old history, to anything that might complicate the story he'd already told. He grabbed the edge of the case and pulled. His hands were shaking. He told himself it was just adrenaline, just the late hour, not fear, not guilt, though some part of him already knew better. The glass front of the case wouldn't budge, easily sealed tight with age and old varnish. He pulled harder, bracing one foot against the wooden base, and felt something inside him tip past a point he hadn't meant to cross. He thought briefly of his father's voice at the dinner table. Everything you have comes with expectations attached. He thought about what it would mean if this whole story unraveled publicly, his father's name dragged through it, his own reputation on campus destroyed before he'd even finished his first semester. He pulled again, harder this time, and the old wood finally cracked. Walt heard the noise from the small maintenance apartment he kept 2 buildings over, a converted storage room he'd lived in ever since his wife passed, years back, close enough to the campus to keep an eye on things most nights, out of habit more than obligation. He grabbed a flashlight and walked over, expecting raccoons or maybe some kids messing around, nothing more serious than that. He let himself in through the front door, calling out into the dark, "Somebody in here?" No answer. He moved deeper into the gym, flashlight sweeping across the old equipment until the beam landed on Tyler, frozen near the shattered trophy case glass, scattered across the floor around his feet, an old photograph clutched in one hand. "Tyler?" Walt said, genuinely stunned. "What in God's name are you doing?" Tyler startled, hard, stumbling backward. I was just," he stammered, panic taking over completely now. Walt stepped closer, taking in the broken glass, the damaged case, the fear plastered across the boy's face. "You need to put that down and talk to me," Walt said, his voice steady despite his own racing heart. "Whatever's going on here breaking things isn't going to fix it." Tyler backed away, instead bumping hard into a nearby equipment rack. It toppled, Old weights and gear crashed down, and Walt, stepping forward instinctively to steady it, caught the edge of a falling barbell across his forearm. He went down hard, pain shooting up through his arm, a sharp cry escaping him before he could stop it. Tyler stood frozen for a horrified second, watching the old man crumple to the gym floor. Then, driven by panic rather than any real decision, he turned and ran out the side door into the dark street beyond, leaving Walt alone on the cold concrete floor of a gym that had once meant everything to this town. Walt lay there for several long minutes before he managed to pull his phone from his pocket, his arm throbbing, his breath ragged. He called Claire first before anyone else, his voice tight with pain but steady enough to get the words out. "Claire," he said, "I need you to come to the old gym. Something's happened." She was there within 8 minutes, breaking every reasonable speed limit in town to get there, finding Walt propped against the base of the shattered trophy case, cradling his arm, glass scattered across the floor around him. "Walt," she said, dropping to her knees beside him. "What happened? Who did this?" Walt looked up at her, pain etched clearly across his face, but something else there too, something heavier than the physical injury. "It was the boy," he said. "Vance's boy. He was tearing this place apart when I found him." Claire felt something cold and sharp settle into her chest, sharper than anything she'd felt since this whole ordeal began. "Did he hurt you on purpose?" Walt shook his head slowly. "No, panicked. Ran into the rack trying to get away from me. Wasn't trying to hurt anybody, just trying to hide something." Claire looked around at the destruction, the broken glass, the scattered photographs, and medals that had survived 30 years in that case only to end up shattered across the floor in a single desperate night. She helped Walt to his feet, careful of his arm, and got him settled in her car to drive him to the emergency room. On the drive over, Walt sat quiet for a long stretch, cradling his arm against his chest, watching the dark streets of Millbrook pass by outside the window. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "Should have called out louder before I went in there. Should have called the police straight off instead of playing hero at 72 years old." "Don't do that," Claire said. "Don't carry blame that isn't yours." Walt let out a short, pained laugh. "Funny hearing that from you. You've been carrying blame that isn't yours since the day you walked into that classroom." Claire didn't have an answer for that. They rode the rest of the way in silence, and at the hospital, while a nurse examined Walt's arm, Claire sat in the waiting room with her father's photograph pressed flat inside her jacket pocket, running her thumb along its worn edge. She thought about how many nights her father must have sat in rooms just like this one, waiting on fighters he'd trained, worrying over injuries that came with the sport he loved. She understood, in a way she hadn't fully understood before, how much of himself he'd poured into people who didn't always deserve it, and how he'd kept pouring anyway, because that was simply who he was. She wondered if she had that same capacity in her. She wondered if, after everything, she still wanted it. But before she left the building, she paused for just a moment near the wreckage of the trophy case, looking down at an old photograph that had fallen free from its frame during the chaos. A photograph of her father, younger, standing beside a thin, serious-looking teenage boy in an oversized boxing jacket. She picked it up carefully and slipped it into her jacket pocket. Some part of her already understood that this small, damaged photograph might matter more than anyone in Millbrook realized yet. By the next morning, Tyler had already built his explanation, the same way he'd built the video that got Claire suspended in the first place, twisting just enough truth into a shape that served him. He told his father, and later the campus security office, that he'd noticed a side door left open at the old gym and gone to check on it, only to encounter an unknown intruder inside, someone who'd knocked over equipment and fled before he could get a good look. He said nothing about the trophy case. Nothing about the photograph. Nothing about panicking and running while an old man lay injured on the floor behind him. Richard Vance, informed of the incident early that morning, made a series of quiet calls before the local police even arrived to take a statement. Calls that somehow softened the language of the initial report. Calls that ensured the responding officer treated Tyler's account as a concerned student stumbling onto vandalism, rather than anything more serious. By midday, the story circulating around Millbrook was simple and clean. An unknown vandal had broken into the old gym, nothing more. Walt's account, given from a hospital bed with his arm now in a temporary cast, contradicted that story completely, but with his memory understandably shaken from the pain and the late hour, and with no clear footage yet recovered to confirm his version, his statement carried less weight than it should have. Claire stood outside the locked gates of the old gym later that evening, having driven Walt home from the hospital and settled him in for the night, and looked through the chain link at the darkened building where her father had once taught half this town how to stand back up after getting knocked down. She thought about the photograph in her jacket pocket of her father and a young Richard Vance, taken decades before any of this began. She thought about a promise made in a hospital room 2 years ago. Don't use your fists to prove anything anymore. Teach people how to stand up instead. That's a better fight, and it lasts longer. She wrapped her hand around the cold metal of the fence, the whistle resting still and silent against her collarbone. Behind her, footsteps approached across the gravel lot. She turned to find Ellis Monroe walking up a small notebook tucked under his arm. "Saw your car," he said. "Figured you'd be here." Claire managed a tired smile. "Word travels fast in this town." "Always has." Ellis stopped beside her, looking through the fence at the darkened building. "Heard about Walt. Heard the story going around campus, too, about some mystery intruder." "You don't sound like you believe it." "I don't," Ellis said flatly. "I was there for that drill they're using against you. I know what actually happened. And I've been keeping notes on some things that don't add up either." Claire looked at him, surprised. "What kind of notes?" "Dates, mostly," Ellis said. "Timing. Little comments I overheard that maybe meant nothing on their own, but stacked together start telling a different story than the one everybody's been fed." "Would you be willing to say that out loud? Officially, I mean." Ellis was quiet for a moment, looking at the fence, at the shadows beyond it. "I spent a lot of years staying quiet," he said finally. "Kept my head down at the plant, kept my head down after the divorce, told myself minding my own business was the safest way to get through a day." He shook his head slowly. "Watching what's happened to you this past week, I'm starting to think safest isn't always the same thing as right." Claire felt something loosen slightly in her chest, the first real relief she'd felt in days. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Ellis said, echoing without knowing it the exact words Margaret had said to Frank Delgado earlier that same week. "We still need proof stronger than my memory and your word. People like Richard Vance don't back down from stories, they back down from evidence." Whatever came next, she understood clearly now. It wasn't going to be settled with fists. It was going to be settled with the truth. And somewhere out there, buried in old wiring nobody had thought to check and answer, was waiting to be found. Ellis walked her back to her car a few minutes later, the two of them quiet, the weight of the night settling around them like the cold air rolling in off the fields at the edge of town. Before she drove off, he leaned in through the window. "For what it's worth," he said, "your daddy sounds like he raised somebody worth standing beside." "Figured that's worth saying out loud, given the week you've had." Claire nodded, throat tight, unable to find words for a moment. "Get some sleep," she managed finally. "We've still got 4 days to turn this around." "Feels like less," Ellis said, checking his watch. "Past midnight already." Claire looked up at the sky, clear and starlit over Millbrook, the same sky her father used to point out to her after long nights training in that old gym, telling her that no fight ever felt this dark forever, no matter how it seemed in the moment. She drove home slowly through the empty streets, past the darkened storefronts on Main Street, past the hardware store with its sign that never changed, past the diner where Frank Delgado and her father used to share coffee on Sunday mornings, decades before any of this began. Somewhere in this town, a boy who resembled his father more than he probably realized was lying awake, terrified of what he'd started. Somewhere else, an old man's guilt was quietly beginning to crack open, after 30 years sealed shut. Somewhere in a quiet kitchen, a retired teacher sat awake too, going back over old faculty photographs, trying to place exactly when the boy she remembered had become the man on that board, and what, if anything, might still be salvaged of who he used to be. And somewhere in between all of it, Claire Bennett drove home with a promise in her chest and a whistle around her neck, unsure yet how she would keep both intact, but certain, for the first time in days, that she wasn't fighting this fight alone. Every town has a night it remembers. A night where something buried finally comes up for air. For Millbrook, Ohio, that night was still 4 days away. Nobody in town knew it yet, but by the time it ended, this story would belong to all of them. Some stories end quietly tucked away in a filing cabinet somewhere, forgotten within a season. Others end loud enough that people talk about them for years afterward, at diners, at church, at kitchen tables across a whole county. This one was about to become the second kind. Claire didn't sleep much over the next 2 days. She spent her mornings at Walt's small apartment, checking on his arm, bringing him coffee, listening to him complain about being told to rest by a doctor half his age. She spent her afternoons with Ellis and Margaret, sitting around Margaret's kitchen table going over every piece of the story they could gather, trying to build something solid enough to stand up against Richard Vance's version of events. It wasn't much, not yet. A handful of dates, a few inconsistent statements, a photograph of 2 people from 30 years ago that proved a connection but not a crime. "We need that footage," Margaret said again on the third afternoon, tapping her pen against the table. "Frank's pushing it through board channels, but it's slow. Whitfield's stalling, whether he means to or not." "There's still the main system," Ellis said, "the one that covers the entrance and the parking lot. If it caught Tyler arriving or leaving that night, that alone tells a story." "Assuming nobody's deleted it by now," Claire said quietly. "Frank thinks the main system backs up automatically to an off-site server," Margaret said. "Even if somebody wanted to delete it locally, there'd likely be a copy sitting somewhere the college doesn't advertise. Standard practice for insurance reasons, apparently." "That's something at least," Ellis said. "It's not enough on its own," Claire said. "Not against a family with Richard's kind of reach in this town. We need something nobody can argue with. Something that shows exactly what happened, start to finish." Ellis rubbed at his jaw, thinking. "What about the campus resource officer? He does rounds most nights. Might have noticed something even if he wasn't looking for it." "Already asked," Margaret said. "Nothing useful. Says he clocked out early that night for a family thing." "Convenient," Claire muttered. "Might just be coincidence," Margaret allowed. "This town runs on coincidence half the time. Doesn't mean it always is one." Walt, sitting at the end of the table with his arm in its sling, had been unusually quiet through most of the conversation. He set his coffee cup down. "There's another camera," he said. Everyone turned to look at him. "What do you mean, another camera?" Claire asked. Walt shifted in his seat, choosing his words carefully. "Years back, before the college ever took over that building, there'd been a few break-ins. Kids after equipment, mostly. Your daddy asked me to help him rig up a second system. Cheap little thing, separate from anything official. Just enough to catch faces, if it ever happened again." "Is it still running?" Margaret asked, leaning forward. "Far as I know," Walt said. "Nobody at the college ever knew about it. Wasn't part of any official inventory. Your daddy paid for it himself out of pocket. Kept the recorder tucked behind a loose panel near the equipment room." Claire felt something tighten in her chest. Hope, this time, not dread. "Walt," she said. "Why didn't you mention this sooner?" "Honestly," Walt admitted, "I forgot it existed until just now. Old age isn't kind to memory, especially the kind of memory that gets shoved into a corner for 15 years. "Can we get to it?" Ellis asked. Walt nodded slowly. "I've still got a key. Building's not sealed off from maintenance access, just from student use, since the incident." Claire stood up from the table. "Then let's go tonight," she said, "before anyone thinks to check that room for anything else." The 4 of them arrived at the old gym just after dark, Walt leading the way with a flashlight, his arm still stiff in its sling, but his steps steady enough. The building smelled like dust and old varnish, the broken trophy case still sitting near the entrance, most of the glass swept into a corner but never fully cleaned up. Claire felt a pang looking at it, at the space where her father's photographs used to sit. She let her fingers trail along the edge of the ring ropes as they passed, remembering afternoons spent right here, sweating through drills, while her father called out corrections from the corner patient, exacting, never once raising his voice, even when she got something wrong for the 5th time in a row. The place had gone quiet these last few years. Standing in it now, she could almost hear it again, the rhythmic thud of gloves against leather, the squeak of shoes against canvas, her father's steady voice cutting through it all. Walt led them past the ring toward a narrow supply room near the back wall and pried loose a wooden panel that looked at a glance like nothing more than part of the wall itself. Behind it sat a small dust-covered recorder, wires running up through the wall to a camera tucked discreetly above the equipment room door, angled to catch anyone entering from the side entrance. Ellis crouched down beside Walt, examining the unit. "Still got power," he said, pointing to a small blinking light. "Must be wired into the building's main circuit." "Your daddy never did anything halfway," Walt said, a faint smile crossing his face for the first time in days. It took nearly 20 minutes to figure out how to extract the footage, the system old enough that none of them fully understood its interface at first. Ellis, who'd spent years working with factory machinery, finally managed to connect it to a laptop Margaret had brought along. They gathered around the small screen in the dim light of the supply room. Claire's hands were steady on the outside. Inside, her heart pounded harder than it had during any fight she'd ever stepped into. Ellis scrolled to the correct date and time. The footage was grainy black and white, but clear enough. Tyler Vance, walking through the side door alone, glancing around nervously, moving toward the trophy case. The 4 of them watched in silence as the scene played out exactly as Walt had described it. The confrontation, the panicked stumble, the equipment rack, toppling, Walt falling, Tyler freezing for a horrified second before running. Nobody spoke for a long moment after the footage ended. Margaret was the first to break the silence, her voice unsteady. "That poor boy," she said quietly. "Whatever else he's done, he looks terrified in that footage, not vicious. Terrified." Claire watched the frozen frame a moment longer. Tyler's face caught mid-turn and found she couldn't disagree. "Doesn't make it right," Ellis said. "But it does make it human, I suppose." "That's it," Margaret said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "That's everything we need." Claire stared at the frozen frame on the screen, at Tyler's face caught mid-turn as he fled the building. She didn't feel triumph looking at it. She felt something heavier, something closer to sadness. "He's 18 years old," she said quietly. "And he's already this scared of the truth?" "Wonder where he learned that from," Walt said, not unkindly, just tired. Margaret began packing up the laptop, careful with the cables the way a person handles something they know matters more than its size suggests. "I'll get copies made tomorrow," she said. "Multiple copies, somewhere safe, somewhere Richard can't touch." "Good thinking," Ellis said. They locked up the old gym behind them that night, the 4 of them, walking out together into the cool evening air. None of them saying much, all of them carrying the same quiet weight of knowing something had just shifted, even if the hardest part still lay ahead. The next morning, Sully found Ellis in the campus library before classes started, sitting alone at a table near the back. "Can I talk to you?" Sully asked, hovering awkwardly by the chair across from him. Ellis studied him for a moment, then nodded, gesturing to the seat. Sully sat down, twisting his hands together, clearly working up the nerve for something. "I was there," he said finally, "during that drill. The one they're using against Miss Bennett." Ellis kept his expression neutral, waiting. "She didn't do anything wrong," Sully continued. "Her hand was on his shoulder for like 2 seconds, showing him how to plant his feet. That's it. That's the whole thing." "Why are you telling me this now?" Sully looked down at his hands. "Because Walt got hurt," he said. "Because Tyler's been walking around acting like none of this actually matters, like it's all just some story that'll blow over. And I keep thinking about how quiet I've been this whole time, how I just kept laughing along because that's easier than saying something." He looked up, meeting Ellis's eyes. "I don't want to be the guy who stayed quiet," he said. "Not about this." Ellis leaned back in his chair, considering him carefully. "What changed?" he asked. "You've had a week to say something. Why now?" Sully was quiet, gathering his thoughts. "My little brother's in middle school," he said finally. "Kid looks up to me, more than he should, honestly. Follows me around, wants to wrestle, like I do, wants to be exactly like me." He shook his head slowly. "I keep picturing him watching all this, watching me stay quiet while somebody good got run out of a job over a lie. I don't want to be the example he learns from." Ellis nodded slowly, something in the young man's honesty landing harder than he expected. "That's a good reason," he said. "Feels a little late," Sully admitted. "Late's better than never," Ellis said. "Trust me on that one. Took me 34 years and a divorce to figure out some things worth figuring out a lot sooner." Sully managed a small, tired smile at that. "You willing to say that out loud?" Ellis asked. "In front of people? Maybe in front of the board?" Sully swallowed hard, but nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I am." "I'll talk to Miss Bennett," Ellis said. "Let her know you're willing. She'll want to hear it from you directly, I imagine, before anything official happens." "Okay," Sully said. "Yeah, okay." He stood to leave, then paused. "Is Walt doing all right?" he asked. "I heard his arm got hurt pretty bad." "He's healing," Ellis said. "Tough old guy. Wouldn't slow down even if you asked him to." Sully nodded, relief flickering across his face, and walked out of the library with a little more steadiness in his step than he'd carried in. Meanwhile, across town, Richard Vance sat in his office at the dealership staring at a phone message he'd received from Frank Delgado that morning, informing him the security footage request had officially been approved through board channels, expected to be reviewed at Legacy Night, alongside the vote on the gym's future. Richard read the message 3 times. He told himself it didn't matter, told himself whatever the footage showed, it would simply confirm the story Tyler had already given. An unknown intruder, nothing more. But some old, familiar instinct in him, the same instinct that used to warn him in the ring decades ago when an opponent was about to change tactics, told him something different. He called Tyler that afternoon, asked him directly, calmly, exactly what had happened that night at the gym. "I already told you," Tyler said, his voice tight over the phone. "Some intruder. I scared him off." "Walk me through it again," Richard said, slowly. Tyler hesitated just slightly before launching back into the story, but this time Richard caught the small pause before certain details, the way his son's voice shifted register when he reached the part about the trophy case. He'd spent 30 years in car sales reading hesitation in strangers across a negotiating table for a living. He recognized it now in his own son's voice, and it landed harder than any customer's lie ever had. "Tyler," he said quietly, "is there anything you haven't told me?" There was a long pause on the line. "No, Dad," Tyler said finally. "That's what happened." Richard didn't believe him, not fully, but he let the conversation end there anyway, telling himself he'd get the full truth eventually, one way or another. For the first time since this entire situation began, Richard Vance felt something he'd spent 30 years avoiding. Doubt. Not just doubt about his son's story, doubt about himself and every quiet compromise that had led both of them to this exact moment. He sat at his desk long after the call ended, staring at nothing in particular, running back through years of decisions he'd never once questioned at the time. The lease vote, the silence at that meeting decades ago, the quiet calls he'd made to soften a police report just days earlier, telling himself each time that he was simply protecting his family, never once asking what exactly he was protecting them from. He thought about the boy he used to be sweeping a gym floor for free, prouder of that than he'd been of almost anything since. He wondered for the first time in a long while whether that boy would even recognize the man sitting at this desk. The remaining days passed quickly after that, each one bringing another piece into place. Margaret, working alongside Frank Delgado, confirmed that the official campus footage from the main entrance had also survived, corroborating Walt's backup system, entirely showing Tyler's car parked 2 streets over the night of the break-in, and Tyler himself walking briskly away from the building only minutes after Walt's emergency call went out. She also uncovered something else during her efforts, A recorded voicemail Whitfield had left for a colleague weeks earlier, accidentally forwarded into a shared department folder, discussing pressure from a board member to slow-walk any footage related to what he called the Bennett situation. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't even particularly incriminating on its own, but paired with everything else, it painted a clear picture, a system quietly bent to protect one family's comfort at the expense of the truth. Margaret sat with that voicemail for a long while before deciding what to do with it, turning the small ethical question over in her mind more than once. She hadn't gone looking for it. It had simply landed in her lap, forwarded, by mistake, into a folder she happened to check. She decided in the end that some things found by accident still deserved to be brought into the light, especially when silence had already cost one good teacher her job and one old man a broken arm. She printed a transcript of it and tucked it into the folder she was building alongside Ellis's notes and Walt's recovered footage, one more thread in a rope steadily growing strong enough to hold real weight. Claire spent those days preparing in her own way, not for a fight, but for something she hadn't expected to face again so soon: the gym. Walt, healing steadily, had asked her a simple question 2 days before Legacy Night 1 that changed the shape of everything that followed. "You ever think about opening that ring back up?" he'd asked. "Properly, I mean, not just late nights training alone." Claire had looked at him surprised. "I made a promise," she reminded him. "Your daddy's promise was about fists and proving points," Walt said. "Not about walking away from something that helped this whole town for 30 years. There's a difference between fighting to prove something and teaching so somebody else doesn't have to fight alone." Claire was quiet for a long moment, watching the late afternoon light fall through Walt's small kitchen window. "I've thought about it," she admitted. "More than once. Standing in that ring these past few weeks training alone, some part of me kept remembering how full that place used to feel. All those voices, all that noise." "Quiet's not always the same as peaceful," Walt said gently. "Sometimes it's just empty, dressed up nice." Claire managed a small smile at that. "You sound like him sometimes," she said. "My father, I mean." "Spent 30 years standing next to the man," Walt said, bound to pick up a phrase or two. Claire thought about that for a long while. She thought about Ellis, 34 years old, coming back to finish something he'd started. About Sully finally finding the courage to speak up. About a boy named Tyler, raised under enormous pressure, who might, with the right guidance, learn a different way to carry that weight than the one his father had taught him. Maybe her father's promise had never meant walking away entirely. Maybe it had simply meant learning when to put the gloves on for the right reasons. Legacy Night arrived on a cool October evening, the old gymnasium at the main campus filled with more people than it had seen in years, folding chairs set out in careful rows, a small stage set up near the front for the evening's program. Half the town showed up: faculty, students, longtime residents who remembered Coach Bennett fondly, and plenty who'd simply come out of curiosity, having heard whispers about everything that had happened over the past 2 weeks. Folding chairs scraped against the old gym floor as people found their seats. The smell of coffee drifted in from a table set up near the entrance alongside trays of cookies somebody's mother had brought, the kind of small-town gathering that had happened in this building 100 times before under far less complicated circumstances. Claire sat near the back with Walt, Margaret, and Ellis, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the whistle resting against her collarbone beneath her collar, hidden from view but impossible for her to forget was there. Sully sat a few rows ahead, alone, having chosen a seat apart from Deacon and Cole for the first time all semester, his knee bouncing under the folding chair with nervous energy. Richard Vance sat near the front in his usual seat, his posture stiff, his expression carefully composed. Tyler sat 2 rows behind him, between his mother and an empty seat where Deacon usually sat, though Deacon and Cole had both quietly distanced themselves from him over the past several days, unwilling to stand too close to a story that no longer felt safe to be attached to. The evening began with the planned program, a brief history of the college's community programs, a few speeches from faculty about the importance of local partnerships, Then Dean Whitfield stepped up to the podium to address the matter everyone in the room had actually come to hear about. "Before we move to the board's scheduled vote regarding the community gymnasium property," he said, his voice carrying an unusual weight, "we have some new information that needs to be shared with this room."
He nodded toward the back where Margaret stood beside a small projector setup. The lights dimmed, the footage played. The room watched in near total silence as the grainy black and white recording showed Tyler entering the old gym alone, the confrontation with Walt, the panicked collapse, the flight into the dark. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd when the footage ended. Richard Vance sat frozen in his seat, his face pale, his hands gripping the armrests of his folding chair. Tyler slid lower in his seat, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Whitfield continued, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "We also have corroborating footage from the main campus system, along with statements from 2 students confirming that the original complaint against instructor Bennett was based on selectively edited video, not an accurate account of events." He gestured, and Sully stood from his seat, walking to the small microphone set up near the stage, his hands trembling slightly, but his voice clear. "I was in that class," Sully said. "I saw what actually happened. Miss Bennett corrected his stance during a drill, that's it. What got sent around campus was cut and slowed down to look like something it wasn't."
He looked briefly toward Tyler, then back at the crowd.
"I should have said something sooner," he added. "I'm sorry I didn't."
He stepped down, and Ellis rose next, walking to the microphone with the calm, steady presence of a man who'd spent years learning exactly how much weight his own words carried. "I've got a factory worker's memory for details," he said, a faint, tired smile crossing his face.
"Comes from years of tracking numbers on a line. I wrote down every date, every inconsistency starting the day this whole thing began."
He held up his small notebook. "None of it lines up with the story we were told," he said. "All of it lines up with the footage you just watched." The room stayed quiet, absorbing everything, the weight of it settling slowly over the crowd like snow. An older man near the front row rose slowly from his seat, leaning on a cane, his suit slightly out of place among the folding chairs and coffee cups. His name was Carl Reyes, a longtime official with the State Amateur Athletic Association, invited to Legacy Night months earlier simply to say a few words honoring Coach Bennett's contributions to the sport over the decades. Nobody had expected him to speak twice. "Forgive an old man for interrupting," Carl said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet room. "But I believe there's one more piece of this story worth sharing tonight." He turned toward the back of the room toward Claire, and something in his expression shifted, recognition dawning slowly across his weathered face. "I thought I recognized you the moment I walked in," he said. "Took me the whole evening to place it. You fought under a different name, if I remember right." Claire felt every eye in the room turn toward her. "The Millbrook Southpaw," Carl said. "State amateur champion, youngest in the division's history at the time. I officiated your final bout myself, 19 years old, fighting a girl 4 years older and 20 pounds heavier, and you took her apart in the 3rd round without breaking a sweat, calm as anything, like you already knew how it would end before it started." A murmur rippled through the crowd, disbelief and recognition tangled together. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "That's who you remind me of," she whispered, half to herself. "I knew there was something." Claire sat frozen for a moment, the whistle suddenly feeling heavier against her chest than it ever had before. She stood slowly, facing the room. "I didn't come to Millbrook to be a fighter again," she said, her voice steady despite the sudden attention. "I came here to teach. That's still true, but I won't pretend anymore that the two things are separate. My father taught me both, and I don't think he'd want me hiding either one." The room settled into a different kind of quiet after that, something closer to awe than shock. The kind of silence that comes when a whole town realizes it had underestimated someone standing right in front of them the entire time. Richard Vance stood up from his seat. For a moment it looked as though he might simply walk out the way a cornered man sometimes does when the room turns against him. Instead, he walked toward the small stage, his steps slower than usual. a confidence that usually carried him through every room in this town noticeably absent. He stopped near the podium and turned to face the crowd. "I owe this room an explanation," he said, "and I owe one family an apology I should have given a very long time ago." The room fell utterly silent. 30 years ago, Richard began, I was a 14-year-old boy with a father who drank and a mother who worked herself half to death trying to keep us fed. I didn't have much of anything back then. He paused, gathering himself. A man named Coach Bennett gave me something nobody else offered. Time, attention, the pair of gloves I couldn't afford, and lessons he never once charged me for. He taught me how to stand up for myself in that ring, and outside of it too. Though it took me a long time to understand that second part. He glanced toward Claire sitting near the back with Walt and Margaret and Ellis. When I got older, when I finally had money and status and everything I thought I'd been missing as a boy, I turned my back on that man, Richard continued. I told myself it was a practical decision, business. The truth is, I was ashamed. Ashamed to be seen walking into a building that reminded this town and reminded me exactly where I came from. His voice caught slightly. I let that gym close. I let a good man carry a burden alone that I could have helped shoulder. And when his daughter arrived in this town doing exactly what her father used to do, teaching, showing up quietly for people who needed it, some ugly part of me couldn't stand to watch it, couldn't stand the reminder. He looked directly at Claire now. I never told my son the real story behind any of this, he said. But somewhere along the way, without meaning to, I taught him the same lesson I learned wrong myself. That power matters more than honesty. That protecting your comfort matters more than protecting the truth. He turned back to face the room fully. That's on me, he said. Not on my son alone, on me. The silence that followed felt different than the silence before, heavier, but somehow less cold. Tyler stood from his seat slowly, unsteady, and walked forward until he stood near his father, near the small stage, near Claire. He looked at her, his usual bravado completely stripped away, replaced by something raw and young and afraid. I don't know how to fix this, he said, his voice cracking. I don't think I can. Claire studied him for a long moment. She thought about the whistle around her neck, about a photograph of two boys, one her father, one his, standing together decades ago in a gym that used to matter to this whole town. She thought about her father's voice, patient, steady, the same voice that had once told her the loudest person in the room isn't always the strongest one in it. You don't fix something like this in one night, she said finally. You fix it slowly, one honest choice at a time. Tyler swallowed hard. I'm sorry, he said. For the whistle, for the video, for all of it. Around them, the room had begun to stir quietly, people talking amongst themselves in low voices, giving the two of them a strange, unspoken privacy in the middle of a crowded gymnasium. Claire studied Tyler for a long moment, remembering her own father's patience with fighters who'd made mistakes far worse than a thrown whistle, remembering how he'd always found a way to separate the person from the worst thing they'd ever done. Claire reached into her pocket and pulled out the old photograph, the one she'd carried since the night of the break-in, and held it out toward him. Tyler took it carefully, looking down at the two young men in the frame, one of them his father, decades younger, standing proudly beside Coach Bennett in an oversized boxing jacket. That's my dad, he asked quietly. That's your dad, Claire confirmed, before the suits, before the plaques. Just a kid who wanted somebody to believe in him. Tyler looked up at his own father, standing a few feet away, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, something passed between them that looked almost like understanding. The board's vote came shortly after, though. By that point, the outcome felt like a formality more than a decision. Frank Delgado called the motion himself, his voice carrying a quiet satisfaction as he read it aloud. A show of hands followed unanimous, not a single member willing to vote against restoring a building that had just been proven beyond any argument to matter this much to this many people. Applause broke out across the room, scattered at first, then steady,
The kind of applause that isn't performed for anyone, just felt. The community gymnasium would remain open, fully restored, funded through a combination of college resources and a personal donation from Richard Vance himself. The first genuinely selfless gesture the man had made in that building in over a decade. Richard stood near the front as Whitfield announced the donation amount, uncomfortable with the attention, but unwilling for once to hide from it entirely. The board also approved a new name for the building, one Margaret proposed, seconded immediately by Frank Delgado: the Bennett Community Boxing Center. Claire, sitting in the crowd, felt tears finally break free, the first she'd allowed herself since this entire ordeal began. Walt reached over and squeezed her shoulder gently with his good arm. "Your daddy would have liked that name," he said. "He would have liked the fight more," Claire said, laughing softly despite the tears. "He always said the best stories end with people standing up, not staying down." 2 weeks later, on a quiet Saturday morning, the newly restored gym opened its doors for the first time in years. Sunlight poured through the high windows, catching the dust still settling from the recent repairs. The ring had been resurfaced. The trophy case, repaired and rebuilt, stood near the entrance, holding what remained of the old photographs and medals alongside a small, new addition. The smell of fresh paint still lingered near the entrance, mixed with the older, more familiar smell of leather and floor wax that never quite leaves a place like this, no matter how long it sits empty. Someone had strung a simple banner across the entrance overnight, hand-painted, the kind of thing a local sign shop puts together as a favor rather than a job. "Welcome back," it read. Nothing fancier than that, though it felt like exactly the right amount of celebration for a town like Millbrook. Cars filled the small gravel lot outside earlier than expected, folks arriving before the doors officially opened, standing around in small clusters, trading stories about the old gym, the way people do when a piece of their town's history gets handed back to them unexpectedly. An old brass whistle, cleaned and polished, resting on a velvet stand at the center of the case. Claire had placed it there herself the night before, her hand lingering on the glass a moment longer than necessary. A small crowd gathered for the reopening. Margaret, Frank Delgado, Dean Whitfield looking noticeably more at ease than he had in weeks. Ellis, standing near the ring with a pair of borrowed gloves already laced onto his hands, having signed up for the very first community class Claire would be teaching that afternoon. Sully stood nearby too, having asked, somewhat sheepishly, if 18 was too old to start learning something his own father had never had the patience to teach him. Walt stood near the entrance, his arm finally free of its sling, greeting old friends who'd wandered in for the occasion, several of them former students of Coach Bennett himself, gray-haired now, some walking with canes, all of them smiling the moment they stepped through those doors and saw the old place brought back to life. One woman, well into her 70s, stopped near the ring and simply stood there for a long moment, hand pressed against her chest, before wiping her eyes and telling Walt that she'd learned to throw her very first punch in this exact spot back when she was 17 years old and the only girl brave enough to show up for lessons. "Coach Bennett never once made me feel out of place," she said. "Told me the ring didn't care who you were outside of it, only cared what you were willing to bring inside it." Walt nodded, familiar with that particular lesson, having heard versions of it from dozens of people over the years. "Sounds like him," he said simply. And near the back of the room, hesitant, uncertain if he belonged there at all, stood Tyler Vance. He'd shown up that morning in plain clothes, no wrestling gear, no bravado, carrying a broom he'd brought from home, unsure exactly what else to offer. Claire spotted him and walked over. "You planning on sweeping the whole floor by yourself?" she asked. Tyler shrugged, awkward. "Figured it was a start. Community service, technically, but also, I don't know. Felt right." Claire studied him for a long moment. "My father used to say something," she said, "about kids who show up to sweep a gym floor before anybody asks them to." "What's that?" "Said those were usually the ones worth teaching." She held out a hand toward the equipment room. "Broom closets through there," she said. "After that, if you're serious, I could use a hand setting up the youth program starting next month. Nothing fancy, just showing kids the basics, footwork, mostly." Tyler looked at her surprised.
You'd trust me with that, after everything? I'm not offering you trust yet, Claire said honestly. I'm offering you a chance to earn it. Same chance your father got a long time ago, from a man who believed people could change if somebody just gave them the room to try. Tyler nodded slowly, something steadying behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. I won't waste it, he said. See that you don't, Claire replied, and for the first time since the day he'd grabbed a whistle off her neck and thrown it to the gym floor, something like the beginning of respect passed quietly between them. Richard Vance stood just outside the entrance watching through the open door, unwilling yet to step fully inside the building he'd once helped close, but unwilling too to stay completely away from the sun he was still learning how to actually see. Walt noticed him lingering there and walked over. You planning on standing out here all day? Walt asked. Richard managed a tired, uncertain smile. Didn't think I had earned a welcome inside yet. Nobody in there thinks you have either, Walt said honestly, but that door's open anyway. Coach Bennett never once turned away somebody willing to show up and try again. Don't imagine his daughter's built any different. Richard looked through the doorway at Claire, crouched beside Tyler near the equipment room, showing him where the extra brooms were kept, at the small crowd gathering around the ring for the afternoon class. He took a breath and stepped inside. Nobody made a show of it. Nobody stopped what they were doing to acknowledge him, but Claire glanced up briefly, met his eyes across the room, and gave him the smallest of nods, an acknowledgement. Not quite forgiveness yet, but a door left open, all the same. Richard found a folding chair near the back wall and sat down quietly to watch the first time in over a decade he'd spent an afternoon inside that building, and the first time in even longer that he'd felt something close to peace sitting inside it. That afternoon, as the first community class gathered around the ring, Claire stood at the center of it, whistle back around her neck, a new cord holding it steady. She looked out at the small crowd, Ellis and Sully among them, a few older residents who'd wandered in out of nostalgia and decided to stay. A handful of younger faces who'd heard the story circulating around town and wanted to see the place for themselves. Tyler stood near the back broom finally set aside, watching the group with careful attention, not yet ready to step forward and join, but no longer standing quite so far outside it either. All right, Claire called out, her voice carrying easily across the room, steady, warm, sure of itself in a way it hadn't quite been on that first morning, weeks earlier. Let's start with the basics. Feet first. Everything else follows the feet. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the group, the particular sound of strangers about to learn something new together, unsure yet how good they'll turn out to be at it, but willing to try anyway. She thought about her father standing in this exact spot for 30 years, teaching people not just how to throw a punch, but how to absorb one, how to stand back up afterward, how to walk away from a fight without needing to win it in order to feel whole. She thought about a promise made in a hospital room 2 years earlier. Teach people how to stand up instead. That's a better fight, and it lasts longer. She raised the whistle to her lips. The sharp sound echoed through the gym, the same sound this building had heard 1,000 times before, the same sound that used to call 3 generations of Millbrook kids to attention decades before any of them, including Claire herself, understood just how far that small, steady sound could carry. Outside, the October sun hung bright over the quiet streets of Millbrook, over the diner and the hardware store and the old brick campus at the edge of town. Over a community that had, in the span of 2 short weeks, remembered something it had nearly let itself forget, that the quietest people in a room are sometimes the strongest ones in it. That guilt, left unspoken, has a way of finding its way back around eventually. That a whistle, an old, scarred piece of brass worth almost nothing in dollars, can still hold enough history inside it to change the direction of an entire town if the right person is patient enough to carry it and brave enough to finally set it down where it belongs. Claire Bennett stood in the center of that ring, surrounded by people learning healing, trying again, and understood more clearly than she ever had before exactly why her father had loved this work so much. Not because it taught people how to fight, because it taught them how to stand back up together every single time life knocked them down. Somewhere in the crowd, an elderly man who'd learned his first jab in this exact building 60 years earlier sat beside a teenager, just starting to learn the very same lesson, the two of them separated by 6 decades and connected by the same small square of canvas. Somewhere near the back, a father who'd spent 30 years running from his own beginnings sat quietly watching his son sweep a floor with more care than he'd shown anything in years. Somewhere in the middle of it all, a woman who'd once promised to put her fists away for good stood teaching a room full of strangers and neighbors how patience and honesty and a willingness to stand back up mattered more than any punch ever could. And later that evening, long after the last student had gone home and the gym had emptied out again, Claire stayed behind a while longer, sweeping the floor herself out of habit, the same way her father used to before locking up each night. She stopped near the trophy case, looking at the whistle resting behind the glass, at the photographs surrounding it, at 3 generations of a town's history, finally sitting together in the light the way they were always meant to. She thought about how strange it was, the way a single ordinary object, an old whistle nobody would have looked at twice in a pawn shop window, had somehow carried a father's whole philosophy inside it long enough to pass it down unbroken to a daughter who needed it more than she'd realized. She thought, too, about how many people in this town had carried their own quiet weights the same way Walt, with his years of silent watching, Margaret, with her decades of noticing what others missed, Ellis, with a divorce and a factory closure and a daughter 2 states away, Richard, with a debt he'd spent 30 years pretending he didn't owe. Every one of them had found their way eventually back to this same small building, drawn by something none of them could have fully explained if you'd asked them outright. Maybe that was what her father had understood better than anyone, that a gym was never really about the fighting. It was about giving people somewhere to come back to once they were finally ready to stand up again. She locked up that night the way her father always had, checking the door twice, flipping the sign, standing for just a moment on the front step under the glow of the streetlight, looking back at the building one more time before heading home. And in a small town in Ohio, on a bright October afternoon that stretched slowly into a quiet October evening, that lesson was only just beginning to spread.